We've reached a point where the loudest reactions to culture come from people that aren't participating in it. That industries worth billions and billions of dollars will cater to anonymous, detached, and often barely functioning in the real world voices that dictate heavily what they do with their massive business decisions that affect everyone when it comes to consuming media. This is oversaturated entitled garbage, and today we are going to be talking about online outrage. And just a heads up, this is the first episode I'm doing without headphones. I'm backing my audio capabilities, so fingers crossed it is up to standard. But I don't anticipate any online outrage. That's a very low hanging fruit joke, but we'll see if it makes the cut. But online outrage, by definition, is outrage online and done by masses. So you can't have online outrage if it's just one person. It has to be many people. It has to be a number of people expressing outrage over a particular issue or topic, whether it comes from movies or TV shows, whether it comes from a statement that someone's made online or a video that they've released. Maybe it's someone, I guess, reporting something that a person of note did and people don't approve. And it is something that in the last 10 years or even 15 years has dictated in entire social movements and entire, I guess, changes in the way that celebrities will conduct themselves, and also what is being made specifically for TV and for movies. And I'll go into like why exactly that is. But I think it's important to kind of note that online outrage is heavily intertwined with the dreaded CC word, and that is cancel culture. So a few years ago, cancel culture probably didn't even really have a term. In reality, people were being cancelled, and then over time, people started attributing this as having a bit of a culture. What is cancel culture? I guess it's people subscribing to the belief that based on wrongdoings, that people should be ostracized from not society, I guess, and it's heavily targeted. It's at public figures, right? So you can't you have to be a public figure to be cancelled, and cancel culture is, I guess, the culture surrounding cancelling public figures. And I guess over the last couple of years, it started to have negative connotations, and there's a lot of, I guess, arguments to say that it spurred a lot of political movements and even shifting of ideologies from perhaps moderate to more right-leaning ideologies, more conservative ideologies. And it comes from this, I guess, people being kind of tired of this idea that that we all have to be catered to, and all our beliefs have to be catered to, and if someone is offended, then we have to kind of appease them, or we have to acknowledge how they're feeling. And I'm not someone who really gets I guess, dies on the hill of different kind of things where it comes to like, oh, this person should be cancelled because they say this. Obviously, I think there's definitely acts that people will do that should definitely mean that they lose their jobs and become ostracized. I think that's how society has worked for decades, if not hundreds of years. They're antisocial people that aren't, I guess, being productive members of society, or they're not contributing positively to society in a way that actually contributing heavily negatively to society, that it's only natural that these people are outcasts, right? But there definitely gets to a point where it depends what ideology we're assigning to. Have they done something really negative? Is it a comment of intolerance? Is it a massive crime they've committed, a horrible crime they've committed, or is it something a little bit more nuanced? And there's many examples of people being cancelled. And like I said, it's definitely resulted in I think a bit of a movement where people are getting, are tired of cancel culture. And I think there's a lot of comedians out there that I guess making a bit of a, not necessarily a comeback, but there's almost like, I guess they would call it a renaissance, right? Now, I'm not calling it a renaissance, but I guess some people might call it a renaissance because all of a sudden, things that might have generated controversy in the comedy space, people are saying them. Saying certain words that a few years ago you couldn't really get away with, or it would definitely become quite a topic. You get an article written about it, if you were dropping certain words. But these days, people seem to be relishing in it, and I think when we look back at origins of cancel culture, it definitely comes from progressive ideology, right? So I think the Me Too movement was one of the OG cancel culture movements. And again, I believe this was before cancel culture was even in anyone's vocabulary or vernacular to even mention that there was a culture. Anyone that obviously commits sexual assault, it makes sense that these people are going to be canceled, that they're going to be ostracized. Now, there's going to be a lot of people that say that accusations aren't enough to cancel somebody, and in some ways that's true, but in some ways I think it depends on the accusation. If the accusation has a lot of merit, if it's coming from somebody who is reputable and believable, then I think preemptively you have to kind of take into consideration the seriousness of certain accusations, especially when it comes to sexual assault. So it makes sense that in the early days, that because of the Me Too movement as part of one of the first kind of movements of canceling people, it makes sense that these guys were canceled. Kevin Spacey is one of the, I guess, one of the prominent figures that comes to mind, obviously, among many. Bill Cosby, another big one. Now, to say that Bill Cosby shouldn't have been cancelled, like that's, yeah, obviously he should have been. He's in prison, or went to prison for the things he did. But someone like Kevin Spacey, who had charges dropped. Now, these he had charges brought to him. These charges were dropped. Never charged with a crime, but easy to say that his reputational damage is irreversible. There's no coming back. It doesn't matter, I guess, how much time. He is definitely tainted. And obviously things happen behind closed doors in Hollywood that us regular folk are not privy to. And I think the way the industry can sometimes react, I think that is often an indicator to not necessarily how believable certain accusations are, but I guess how serious they're being taken by the peers in the industry. Another example would be the Johnny Depp Amber Heard case, where Johnny Depp, he lost jobs. However, he had and still has a big support base that very much behind him when it comes to this kind of stuff. So that is an example, and even on the other side, there's Amber Heard, similar thing. She's got her supporters, and obviously there's there's evidence out there of basically a very, very toxic relationship, and it's one of these things that based on information, it seems like both parties engaged in undue conduct, but based on all of the things that went on, I'm not necessarily gonna I guess, like, I don't know what happened. I followed along just like everyone else, and what I saw was, just a big mess, right? Now, online outrage definitely applies to each of these people, and they all were affected by that in some way. Another big example is Jonathan Majors. So Jonathan Majors was Kang in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He also, where else was he in? He was in a few other movies, which I'll think of it in a certain moment. I think there was he in Rocky? No, he was in Creed. That's right, he was in Creed. So he was in Creed, big movie, and obviously accusations surfaced towards him, assault allegations, domestic violence allegations. And this guy lost his job, right? So he lost his job with Marvel, basically had the biggest kind of paycheck lined up for his career, life-changing money for the rest of his life. And that was, the rug was pulled out from under his feet based off these accusations. And I believe he actually was convicted. But again, online outrage due to these actions, led to him, losing the biggest role of his life in Kang in regards to financial compensation. So again, another prudent example where the masses, if people came out in support of him, if there wasn't this massive online outrage, who knows? The Marvel Cinematic Universe might look very different. And again, I'm not saying that should have happened. It's just an example of the power of writing comments online, maybe writing emails and things like this. And what I think about when it comes to online outrage is what was in its place beforehand. Before the internet made it very, very accessible to voice our distaste. Now, one would kind of imagine maybe phone calls would happen or mail. Like people would probably mail in much more frequently, and I guess the term hate mail exists for a reason. So instead of writing anonymous messages, people would write maybe anonymous letters, and so the people writing those letters, I guess, would be a lot more committed to communicating that information because they've gone to the trouble of getting the stamp, getting the envelope, putting the letterbox and sending it on its way. Whereas these days, it's easy it's almost, it's very easy to write a comment. So I was going to say it's almost harder not to write a comment. So sometimes when we see a lot of kind of rage bait content, or I know I do, I'll say, I could comment to this person, but I know that there's no point doing it. It's a waste of time. But that's a whole nother story. And those kinds of things probably wouldn't have been as in higher numbers, right? Because obviously you've got letters. They're physical representations of a comment in a lot of ways. But when we talk about comments and the amount of people that use social media to make those comments, it 100% dwarfs any kind of mail that people would have received previously, any kind of letters that people would have received previously, and even the access to knowledge of hearing about these things. So I think a lot of those tabloid stuff, like to do with Johnny Depp and Jonathan Majors and Kevin Spacey, back in the day, that would have filled the front pages of magazines, and they would have sold magazines based off and they would have sold magazines based off that already. But these days, instead of magazines, and it's a point I made on another podcast, is that social media in a lot of ways is really just the modern day version of magazines, right? That instead of being bought from the shelf, it's consumed on our phones or our laptop or computers. And if we think about the implications of anonymous online outrage and what it can do to society. Now, sometimes online outrage isn't about the Me Too movement. It's not about sexual assault. It's not about assault. It's not about outrageous things that people should be ostracized for. Sometimes it's about creative direction choices in films and TV. And when it comes to this, sometimes it can be just as hateful and in just the same amount of numbers, right? The same amount of people sending messages saying that Johnny Depp should be cancelled or Amber Heard should be cancelled or Kevin Spacey should be cancelled, might also be writing in and saying that She-Hulk, sucked. And She-Hulk, broke the fourth wall. That last episode was terrible. Cancel that show. It's a woke TV show. And yes, the term woke isn't something that I often use, but that was part of the critique of the She-Hulk TV show. And the result is that show's probably never coming back. And I think Marvel kind of changed up its tactics a lot based on the feedback from that show. And when we think about that and we think about how all it takes is a lot of comments online that can really change and dictate the direction a studio or production company goes with their particular content. And thinking about movies and thinking about TV shows, I often think about, and it is a very, it's talked about a lot, how movies in the cinema are very different now. Cinema movies, they say, it's a dying industry. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, you could argue the economy and tickets becoming more expensive. And I think something that I've noticed over time, and I'm sure other people have as well, is the amount of, say, local ads that are in the cinemas that never used to be. I remember when I was much younger, you'd go to the movies and you wouldn't even see local ads. You would just see movie trailers. And they could do that because the amount of people going to the movies were consistent enough where they didn't need to seek that kind of revenue. But nowadays, because it's less people going, one, obviously they've got to put up the ticket prices, but two, they have to look at other ways to gain revenue, and that's through local ads. So these days, you're going to see a bunch of local ads and a whole lot less movie trailers. And I'm sure it's probably reached a certain equilibrium where the result is they're probably not going to put too many more ads, or maybe they will slot one or two more in over time. I also think cinemas in a lot of ways have become nicer, and I think they do that so they can justify the higher price tag. So they make them a little bit, I guess, more comfy. Maybe the seats are a bit nicer, and they do it so they can justify jacking up the prices to $30 a ticket or whatever it is. But with that is the changing movies that are in it. And it is a very spoken about topic, how back in the day, you might, a movie like Seven, a psychological thriller, sold very well in the cinemas, did very well. It's a gripping movie. It's not heavy on special effects. It's story driven. It's suspense driven. But something like that nowadays probably wouldn't do that well in the cinema. And it's because obviously there's a much more content that we can consume online, and there's a lot more TV shows and other things like that we can choose to watch instead. So what's happened in the cinema realm is that it's spectacle movies that are most successful, and this isn't a revelation. This isn't anything new. Movies heavy special effects in movies are the ones that generally will do the best. So we think about things like Avatar, right, which is the highest grossing movie. That entire, really, the premise is of watching it heavily comes from the impressive special effects that are in the movie, and no doubt they're very impressive. I'm a fan of Avatar. I went and saw both of the movies in the cinema. With the third one coming out, I probably will do the same. And the reason being is, if you are going to go see those movies, I think the notion is you kind of, you're wasting the experience if you don't go see it in the cinema, considering that is the driver, or that is one of the biggest marketing points, is how visually impressive it is. So the highest grossing movie is Avatar. Prior to that, it was Titanic. Now, Titanic, yes, had special effects, but again, it was mostly story driven. It wasn't necessarily about providing these huge spectacles. It was obviously an engaging story, but it was a romance. It was a tragedy. The spectacle of the ship hitting the iceberg and people jumping overboard, that's a part of it, but the story is what drew people into it. With the scene where Leo is drawing Kate Winslet on the couch, right? Like, everybody who's seen that movie remembers that scene, and that is a big kind of iconic part of that scene. Whereas something like Avatar, it doesn't have the draw me like one of your French girls moments. It's a mostly jaw-dropping special effects that you see it on an IMAX, or what are you doing? Another example, I think, was like Oppenheimer last year. Now, Oppenheimer, different kind of special effects, less CGI, and yes, that was a story-driven movie. However, I think a big driver was Christopher Nolan, who's known for not wanting to use CGI, and how was he going to present the atom bomb explosion? And for me, that was fascinating, kind of think, okay, how is he going to present this? And it was done really well. And I think, again, there was that spectacle, because obviously the creation of the atom bomb, it's very grandiose, but I do think that's an outlier when it comes to successful movies, because it wasn't a heavily a movie that heavily relied on special effects. Obviously, there was that quite crescendo moment, but other than that, it was a character-driven story. Other, yeah, obviously, Marvel. That's yeah. It took me a while to get there, but they're again spectacle movies that bring to life comic book characters that wasn't really an option in the 90s, 80s, that they couldn't bring it together in the same way, right? So it was the advancement of technology that got these movies to be presentable and consumable by mass audiences. And so that's a big part as to why the Marvel Cinematic Universe took off, is because finally the special effects could adequately present those worlds. And with that, obviously, a changing of the guard happened. One could say that the golden age of cinema ended with Marvel, and it's not necessarily because of Marvel or Marvel's fault. It's just a representative or a correlation of special effects reaching a point where it can be a main driver as to why someone will see a movie. Now, what has this got to do with online outrage? What it has to do with online outrage is when movies that are in cinemas are generally made for spectacle, and storylines are kind of secondary. They're made for a particular kind of audience, right? So if you're making a movie that's a few $100 million or around abouts, you want to try and guarantee that the most people possible are going to want to watch that movie. So you want to guarantee an audience. Now, guaranteed audiences will always be children. I think you can always rely on kids going to the movies. It's something to do. It's something to get them out of the house in a way. It's something that the parents can take them to without much energy. They can group them together, and people can take turns. Basically looking after the kids while other people get a break. And kids get excited, right? Kids are excited when a new movie comes out. I think Inside Out 2 was one of the, up until a certain point, was the biggest animated film in history, and it was super, super popular. And that 100%, it's targeted at kids. Whereas, I think potentially you could argue like the prior Disney cartoons, like the originals, I think definitely marketed at kids, but adults was still kind of interested in going to see them because it was, again, there was that novelty. It was still very new, that mode of movies, animated movies, and there was that kind of a classic feel, right? It was a pioneering industry, whereas there's so many new animated movies coming out every season that adults, they're not necessarily interested in going to see these movies. It's much harder to create a classic nowadays, especially even Disney, would find it much harder to create a quote unquote classic movie like Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin and The Lion King and those kinds of movies. So kids, guaranteed audience. Now, I'm also going to say the disability community, right? People who live with disabilities, because again, when we talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, people on the spectrum, generally, they really get into those kinds of things, or the DC Cinematic Universe. And that's just, I guess, when it's something to... it's something relatable, I suppose. I think if someone finds it hard to connect with reality or others in reality, then seeing a superhero on camera, it's like being able to put yourself in their shoes and live through them vicariously, and it's something to engross yourself in. And so for people who live with disabilities, especially autistic people, I think it's very common to say they often love Marvel, they often love DC, they often have intense feelings about characters, and they follow them very religiously. And so that's an aspect of an audience that I think also you can be kind of relied upon on a certain genre. So you got kids and people in the community who live with disabilities, are an example of demographics who will likely go to the cinema for a particular kind of movie no matter what, right? Then if we look at outside of that, you've got obviously a wide variety of people. You've got full-time workers, you've got the parents, as mentioned, so potentially they're going to watch films if they're taking their kids to them. But then you've got, young adults in their 20s, you've got older teenagers, you've got, say, the boomer generation and older. Now, you could argue the boomer generation and older, you're going to the cinemas, was probably a bit of a luxury or a bit of a novelty. But again, age is not necessarily a good correlation for going to see a movie in the cinema. But I do think that people who are older, they're not necessarily going to see Marvel. They're going to see probably those older kind of movies that aren't doing that well in the cinema as much anymore. So taking those two concepts of online outrage, how it dictates or changes directions of major media, and also how modern cinema has changed in a way that films that are character driven, story driven aren't as popular, and so the dependency on reliable audiences is much greater. And when I say reliable audiences, certain demographics, how does that pair with one another, and why is that something that the everyday person should care about? And I look back, at the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, and I think it's intriguing to see how, what celebrities wore. It seemed like society also wore when it comes to fashion. And even in certain TV shows, like sitcoms, the issues that were brought up at those times also reflected the modern, or the socio-political issues that were had during that time. Media reflected reality, and celebrities were obviously placed on a pedestal. So when the movie star of the era comes out wearing a certain style, often people would emulate that. And that's just how people work. And still to this day, that's still relevant. But when we think about the movies themselves and what was popular, I used to be a bit of a movie buff. I used to watch a lot of movies, and I used to watch movies probably 80s to early 2000s is probably, like, I guess, the most amount of movies I've watched. And there's movies in those eras, I think the most popular ones are often very different to what are the most popular movies today. And I think whether we like it or not, it's media like that kind of, I guess, it has a huge impact on how people think and how people behave. And I remember, watching, say, Vanilla Sky as an example of a movie I use. This is a big Hollywood movie starring Tom Cruise, Penelope Cruz, and among other people. It's a remake of a Spanish movie, but I remember watching this movie, and it really provoked a lot of thought within me about objective reality and subjective reality, and even the movie Seven, which I referred to earlier, to thinking about, why does a killer in that's in the movie Seven, why would he do what he did? And it really puts you in his shoes, and it's gripping, and it's also heartbreaking, right? It really puts you in the moment and evokes that emotional response. And yes, it's not real, it's a movie, but I think what's missing today are those kinds of movies in the same level of popularity. When we think about what hits in the cinema, or even what hits on streaming services, it's the same kind of content, and it's marketed a lot differently and toward a lot different demographics than these other movies back, 90s, 2000s were, because previously it was the masses that would go to the cinema, but now it's only certain demographics. Previously, it was everyone who was kind of watching TV, but now everyone watches different streaming services, and they get into their niche. And something that's even been I've seen on another podcast speak about how there's streaming services that take scripts and make them simple because of this idea that people are on their phones while they're watching. So the storylines have to be simplified in order for someone to just be on their phone idly and still understand what's going on. So thinking about the impact that they can have beyond just the I guess the front and center, dumbing the population down, I think movies are ways that can encourage critical thought a lot more than we would give them credit for, because a lot of people don't pay attention in school. A lot of people don't read books. And when we think about visual content in movies and TV shows, for me, it was something that inspired me to get into creative industries, whether it was writing or acting or starting a business and things like this. It was the things that I watched that were the stepping stones to those kind of journeys, because it put me in these worlds that didn't have to be fantastical, but it was the story. It was how I could see myself in those characters' shoes, and these movies were popular, right? They weren't these niche kind of things that it's on one streaming service and it's localized to that, and you got to kind of be a fan of a particular genre already to have seen it. These were the widely available, publicly released, across the globe kinds of movies, and they were thoughtful, and they had some meaning behind it, right? They had unique prefaces and were original. And not saying that there's not original ideas out there. There clearly is. And often original ideas will not reach an audience. And so it's easy to say, oh, well, I miss the days where movies were like this. But there's probably, and with certainty, there's still movies out there like that. The key difference is, though, that it doesn't have the most famous actors in them. And the most famous actors doesn't necessarily mean the best, but often famous actors are famous for a reason, because they are the best actors. Now, as well as directors. So it's like these movies and scripts might be just as quality, but they're not attached to the heavy-hitting directors, which again are in their positions they are for various reasons, because they have that talent among talented people. So they're in the upper echelon of people who are already in the upper echelon. So thinking about how the spectacle of movies have changed, and how online outrage dictates the direction of mainstream content, it boils down to the fact that our society, when we think about pop culture, is being dictated and influenced by faceless, mass, anonymous, online outrage. And if movies are catered to these kinds of people, right, the people that do have the time to go out and comment. Like, for me personally, if I don't like something in a movie, very rarely, if ever, have I ever gone and made a comment. And I guess I would, or sent something. And often I'll read articles about, this great outrage about this certain character, like, a gender role switch, for example, in the Harry Potter TV series. People are talking about how Snape is now black, and they're talking about gender swapping Voldemort. And I get it, people are upset about changing the original story. And for me, I think, it's like, is it going to be a good look having Snape be relentlessly bullied by Harry's dad when, you've got that racial dynamic involved? Maybe they'll play into that. Maybe they'll make Harry's dad a racist. I don't know. Could Voldemort be a female character? Sure. I mean, you have to kind of alter the name, because in the second book or the second movie, people would remember that I Am Lord Voldemort is an anagram, or whatever you call it. It actually spells Tom Ridley, or whatever his name is, right? So they'll obviously have to figure out how to do that. If that, maybe they'll just wipe that aspect from it. But at the end of the day, I don't care enough to write about it. I don't care enough to join in and be like, how could they do this? But I'll read the articles that talk about how people are outraged, And I guess I'll just take the article's word for it. I'll take the word that people I guess are really upset about this. It was like the recent Rings of Power TV series as well, very similar. They came up with some new content, and it was one of the TV shows that I have watched, and I kind of liked it. In fact I did like it, and the problem is, well, one of the big kind of things that could happen when people are so upset and they say this thing's so bad is that they're not going to renew it. And for me, it's like, I think, wouldn't people rather have the wouldn't people rather have it than not? I feel like it's a good thing to have this content be made, because one, its source material comes from really, I guess, quality content, right? There's a reason why Lord of the Rings has stood the test of time. It's because J.R. Tolkien was a genius, and he knew how to write characters. He knew how to create a story that got people to attach meaning to. Now, obviously, J.K. Rowling is a very controversial figure now, but the books, in the same way, it was a phenomenon. People wanted to be Harry, they wanted to be Hermione, they wanted to live in that wizarding world, and she created it so well, and it was well written material. And so for me, I look at the net positive of that material being made, and I think that it's a good thing. It's a positive thing that Rings of Power was made, and controversy aside, it's a positive thing that Harry Potter TV series is being made. And I think that people should be, happy that their favorite series, whether it's Lord of the Rings or whatever, like, that it's continued to stand the test of time. It's still being made, because I think you can still connect with that, and I think it's still on a baseline of quality content. Something like Star Wars, however, which doesn't necessarily have as deep a lore, is a different thing. And again, with Star Wars, there was a lot of outrage with some character decisions. Now, I never cared enough to ever participate, but I read the articles about them, and I took my word for it. But at some stage, we have to question, well, what actually is online outrage? And online outrage is cancel culture in reality, right? So, and then online outrage leads to cancellation of public figures. So I'm not someone to come out and be like, cancel culture, should not exist, because I think 100% certain people should be ostracized based on their actions. And sometimes if an accusation is credible, then I don't think one should necessarily have to be convicted or wait for a conviction for that to have some follow through. I think obviously the subjective angle there is, what is a credible accusation? Because I think about a situation like, if I was in someone's shoes and I had accusations against me and they weren't true, but maybe they were a number, you think about how that exactly would happen. I mean, you could make some kind of conspiracy, say, oh, they're out to get this person. But I think if there's a number of accusers, that's pretty credible. And I think if the person who comes out and has accused is like an upstanding member of society and doesn't have a history of doing anything that's like horribly negative, then again, it's a pretty credible kind of thing. Not to say that there aren't exceptions, but I think overall you've got to kind of take those things at face value. So it's not as if that, I'm not necessarily against the culture of canceling people that deserve to be ostracized. What I'm speaking about is how online outrage is like a blanket. It's like this fog that once it's reported that people are outraged, then all of a sudden it's true and it's representative of how people feel, even though the people that go to make these comments and care enough to make these comments, again, we don't know who these people are. We don't know if they're participating members of society. We don't know if they're just trolling and they're just like, kids, essentially. Like, how much due diligence goes into from these big media companies to track, okay, what's actually going on? Is this legitimate? And who are these people? Because sometimes it doesn't necessarily matter who these people are. If there's enough people calling for something, or if there's enough people commenting to the point where it can affect people's perceptions that aren't even involved. Like if I hear about a movie's really bad and terrible because a bunch of people didn't like a certain aspect of it, I think it's human nature to be like, oh, maybe it's true. Maybe I don't want to go see that movie. I think, say, for another example is the Mighty Supreme movie in the opposite way, right? Is people are talking about how good that movie will be, even though no one's, I mean, a few people have seen it. I like the director from it for sure. But again, it's like, why is that seen as, why is that getting driven up so much? And obviously the obvious answer is there's marketing involved, but it's just interesting that sometimes even with big marketing pumps, for some reason it just goes the other way, and then when it goes the other way it can snowball, and it can have massive effects on what comes next. So there's this intertwined relationship between online outrage and cancel culture, but also there's an intertwined relationship between what is the popular media that is brought out and what these big kind of companies need to rely upon. Now, they need to rely upon not basically getting the death knell of online outrage to do with their content. So if that's on their mind front and center, they're not going to necessarily make anything controversial. You don't necessarily need something to be controversial to be good, but they are looking at it through the lens of not necessarily making a good movie, but a movie that, one, is going to sell tickets, and two, isn't going to ruffle any feathers. And I don't think that's a good way to be looking at art. And I don't think it's good for our society when the mass amounts of media we consume are devoid of true meaning. Like, you can only present the Marvel structure so many times before it gets old. Now, I know they're trying really hard to bring it back, but I think, sure, they'll have some successful movies, but I think for the most part, the comic book movie boom is over, because there's only a few characters that can stand the test of time, and I think Batman's one of them. Spider-Man is another, because these are characters that existed before the well-established cinematic universes, and I think they connect with people because of the character itself, and I think they're quality characters, right? So Spider-Man is a quality character, Batman is a quality character, Superman. I think for some time, I don't think people have really made a super successful Superman movie that hasn't kind of copped a lot of criticism when compared to Batman, when compared to Spider-Man, for whatever reason that is. I think Batman and Spider-Man are definitely the most successful Marvel and DC characters, and the other characters outside of that, I think you can't rely upon them being consistently successful. I think the story of Batman and the story of Spider-Man is also a high quality story, and again, it evokes an emotional response, whereas the majority of those comic book movies, they're following a certain criteria or formula, and it gets kind of old, and it doesn't it doesn't really evoke that response that a good movie does. I know there's a movie recently like Frankenstein, right? So Frankenstein, again, that's a remake, and Guillermo del Toro, did his own spin on that, but that's taking, again, classic literature that stands the test of time, and it's something that it evokes an emotional response. It reaches people. It isn't tired tropes. It isn't cliche, and I think we're overwhelmed with such cliche content that's the norm. So when something's good, it really stands out, but again, it has to have that distribution. It's got to have the high quality actors, the high quality directors, because even if a director is pretty good, there's a big difference between a pretty good director and one of the best directors in the world taking a movie and creating something with it. So, in summation, I know I've kind of hit more topics than necessarily just on online outrage, but I think online outrage is heavily linked to cancel culture, and the media that we consume is linked to both. And what happens in society when the media that is mass produced for consumption is made in such a way that it's made for special effects, it's made to appeal to audiences in a way that we'll go and see them in the cinemas, right? So it's made for kids, it's made for people in the community who live with disabilities, right? And not to say that people with disabilities can't enjoy high quality movies. Is that I'm talking about, it's that overwhelmingly the biggest fans of Marvel are on the spectrum, and that's just, it's clearly indicated in the reality of the situation. I've spoken with many people who live with disabilities, and it's kind of given. You can always go, you like Marvel, and 90% of the time they're going to say yeah. You like DC, 90% of the time they're going to say yes, in regards to people on the spectrum, right? So when we have big studios that are catering to specific kinds of audiences, they're not thinking about trying to create art. They're creating a product, and that product is trying to sell, the most tickets with the least amount of controversy. And they use the same tropes, the same kind of cliches, the same old tired stories. And for me, I think it's a shame that a movie like Seven, or say a character driven movie like When Harry Met Sally, right? That'll never kind of have that same kind of success in the movies again, because simply put, like, the people that are interested in those kinds of movies on the whole, they'd watch it at home, and even if it was available at home, it's overwhelmingly buried by the I guess the really surface level shows that are out there, that are kind of made for idle watching, right? Not to evoke kind of deep thought. It's made for someone who's distracted, going to sleep, and watching something for comfort. And I think it's a big shift in how we think and how we also kind of look to media to fulfill our desires. So I want to finish on kind of asking the question was, what is the most meaningful movie or TV show that you've watched recently, and compare it to something that maybe is 20 years old, 30 years old, that you've watched that you also thought were meaningful, and what are the big differences between it, and what are the similarities, but also what are you watching currently or consistently, and how does that vary from some of your favorite, like, older content? Do you think it's, am I wrong? Do you think that it's on par, or do you think there is a lot that's different between that kind of content and the content we used to have 20, 30 years ago? And is there an answer? Is there a solution going forward? I'm not really sure. But the fact is, that's where we're at. So a bit of a philosophical episode, I suppose, and how there's a bit of a trickle down effect of online outrage to everyday people who don't participate in it. And I'd love to hear people's thoughts about what I've gone over, and whether it makes sense or whether I miss some very important details. And I'm always open to that kind of critique and feedback. But you've been watching and listening to Oversaturated Entitled Garbage. I look forward to chatting next week, and I hope you have a good rest of your week. I'll see you next week.